video. Now that I've remembered to start the video, it wasn't necessary to record me. So the most important thing is to record our panelists. And I am delighted that we have three excellent panelists here today for our session. I'm going to give you their biographical details right now. And then as they each speak in turn, I will put their biographical information in the chat. So you have that available as well. I will also remind our panelists and you that we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes each for the panelists to talk, and then give them an opportunity to respond to each other and perhaps to a question from me if I have one. But we will really be encouraging questions from the audience. And so we have a Q&A function. You can put your question there, but the chat function is also available. So if you have any real-time comments or suggestions, please put those in the chat. It would be lovely to know where you all are coming from. And if you could introduce yourself in the chat, that would be fabulous. I am in Western Massachusetts, and we have Lala coming from Colombia. Ariel is in Brazil, and Kenny is in South Africa. So, and our interpreters are from Ecuador and from Colombia. So we have a wonderful distribution, shall we say, of participation in our session today. So let me introduce our speakers in the order that they'll be speaking in. Kennedy, or Kenny Manduna, is a visiting scholar and fellow at the University of Potsdam and a research fellow at Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. He's a postdoctoral research fellow as well at the Center for Excellence, Adaptation and Resilience at the University of South Africa. He is the author of the forthcoming Extractive Industry Indigenization in Zimbabwe. Lala Peñaranda is the Latin America Coordinator for Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, or TUED. She is completing an MA in Law and Economics of Climate Change in Flaxo in Argentina. She has also worked as a tenant organizer at Met Council on Housing and as an editor at NACLA. Ariel Salleh is Distinguished Visiting Scholar in the Center on Labor, Sustainability and Global Production at the Queen Mary University of London. And she's a visiting professor in the Faculty of Humanities at Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. She is the author most recently of DeColonize, EcoModernism, and we'll provide a link to that as well in the chat. I read it recently. I highly recommend it, so encourage you all to check that out. So we're going to start with Kenny. It is all yours. Thank you for kicking off our conversation. Think you're still on mute. Let me see if I can help you with that.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, hear you perfectly.
Okay. I'm sorry, I was trying to share my screen. And you can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you very much, John, for inviting us to share our thoughts on this pertinent and critical topic of our time, if I can put it this way. So I have this title I just wanted to share with you with regards to the transformation of industrial politics globally. But I will zero in more in the African continent vis-a-vis its engagement with the global world, particularly like the US, Europe, and China. So I gave a title, The Post-2008 Green Industrial Politics, Keynesian Economics, Extractivism, Resource Nationalism, and Geopolitics. The reason being I gave this title Since the end of the great financial recession in 2008, what we have witnessed is the return of the Keynesian economics. Reason being, we have seen governments now trying to directly intervene or interfere into the economy, because neoliberalism has been said to have been failed dismally, evidenced by the great financial recession itself. So what are we seeing now? We are seeing, in the continent, in Africa, the return of industrial politics or industrial policies is now being also dominated predominantly by extractivism. And in many ways as well, it is manifesting itself from a resource nationalistic perspective. At the same time, finding a lot of geopolitical shifts and competitions and tensions, with many African countries being used as kind of the local manifestations of the global geopolitical fights. So, to just give a brief, we are witnessing the resurgence of industrial policies. But what we have seen, history has taught us that industrial policies are crisis management tools. We have seen it post the Great Financial Recession, 2008, after the COVID-19 pandemic, or during the COVID-19 pandemic, if I can put it that way. That is when we have seen a lot of government now introducing a lot of industrial policies to say, let the government now intervene more into the economy, introducing, say, for example, financial stimulus packages. We also read that in South Africa about 500 billion rand, simply because the economy was no longer be able to sustain with the private sector alone. So that is why for now we are now witnessing that resurgence more, because we are at a crisis situation, the poly-crisis we are finding ourselves at. Multiple crises taking place at once, from COVID-19, from deadly climate change devastation, we go to democratic backsliding, degrowth, a lot of economic problem, also political problem. They are intersected. So the green industrial policies, they are not coming to replace the brown industrial policies. And that paradigm shift itself is producing a lot of heated politics. In a way, also wanting to make sure that the global value chain is resilient in all countries. Geopolitical concerns to also promote growth, job creation, and basic national security. I just wanted to put this across. These green industrial policies, these legal frameworks, are the ones with a huge impact in the continent. For example, the US Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. In itself, is the US's expression of going green. But the question now is, how are they going to source those critical and strategic minerals, the rare earth elements? And as we know, more than 50% of them are located in the global south. The IMF report of last year, I think around April, has revealed that over 30% of them are located in sub-Saharan Africa, making the region itself very much contentious when it comes to global geopolitical concerns. So we are now seeing, we have also seen the EU's Green Deal its industrial plan for net zero. The EU Critical Raw Materials Act, from the Chinese side, we have made in China 2025, and also China's 14th 5-year plan, 2021 to 2025. These ones have got a huge impact in the continent. The reason being, the continent now, especially sub-Saharan Africa, is now a geopolitical chessboard where these big powers are competing for these rare earth elements, critical minerals, strategic metals. In the African continent, what we have seen in response to these global geopolitical competitions, in response to the world turning green, to the global world also enacting and implementing green industrial policies, a lot of African countries are also now adopting and implementing them. In the context of South Africa, we have what we call the green industrial policy. What is it all about? To help transitioning to clean energy, just energy transition. And a lot of operational policies, for example, the Just Energy Transition Implementation Plan. All these are to make sure that we are globally aligned, and also we are helping ourselves from to transition to clean energy itself. And a lot of them are also witnessed in many African countries. In Nigeria, in Angola, Equatorial Guinea, they are diversifying the economy away from fossil fuel, trying to decarbonize the economies, also to try to go up the value chain. How to do that? Value addition, innovation, beneficiation, especially of minerals. In South Africa, we are also talking about the clean coal, to try by all means to say it might be part of the fossil fuel, but we also want to employ current technologies to make it clean in a way that it is not going to cause a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. So you go to countries like Rwanda, Ethiopia, Cote d'Ivoire, Mauritius, the focus is almost the same, to make sure that jobs are created in that green economy, focusing on tradable and safe export, renewable energy, trying by all means to run away from fossil fuel-based energy systems. What we are witnessing now, because of that, we are witnessing deadly geopolitical competitions in the continent. For example, a 1 billion euro 2023 Brussels EU Namibia business partnership. What is it for? For green hydrogen, because Namibia, by the way, is one of the biggest reserves of green hydrogen globally. And also critical minerals. The country also has a lot of lithium and other rare earth elements. 2.2 billion US, Angola, EU, DRC, Zambia Memorandum of Understanding. What is it for? To refurbish the Lobito Railway Corridor. That one is from Zambia via DRC to the port of Lobito in Angola. And what is it all about? To make sure that the transportation or exportation of minerals mined from the African Central Copper Belt is so easy via the Atlantic Ocean. Then we have the EU Commission's agreement on critical minerals value chains with DRC and also with Zambia on their individual capacities as well. Another one is USR loan with Zambia and DRC to centralize electrical vehicle battery manufacturing in the two countries. Then another one, EU and Rwanda. We are also now seeing Britain is considering like towing its decades-long hostile relationship with Zimbabwe after, I think, almost 25 or more than years now. Why? Zimbabwe is the biggest reserve of lithium in the continent. I think around number 6 or number 5 in the world. So we are seeing these competitions, and China, on the other hand, is also coming in trying to displace the Western one. Another geopolitical competition we are seeing in the continent, there are a lot of what I want to call new versions of the Berlin conferences in the format of this one. And if we are to look at it, what is predominantly dominating this summit is the extraction, is the exportation of Africa's raw, critical, strategic minerals and rare earth elements to these countries. The only difference now we are seeing is that the African now is now on the table at these conferences. But to many African citizens, it is giving them back that deja vu feeling to say, are we now going back to what we have seen, like what we have been reading in our history books, that the continent was partitioned in a way we didn't benefit anything from what followed. So it's a replay of the waters of the scramble for Africa and with the colonization which ensued. Some geopolitical competition as well. What we have seen, Tanzania and Burundi, there is a $2.1 billion railway construction deal with 2 Chinese companies. Zimbabwe, the biggest lithium reserve in the continent, is about 3 of its biggest lithium mining companies, either 100% owned by the Chinese or in large part owned by the Chinese. Then we are also seeing the rehabilitation of the Tazara railway line. That one is from Zambia via Tanzania to the port at Dar es Salaam. It's a 1 billion like a project itself. And for what reason? It is for facilitating transportation of these critical minerals from the African Central Copper Belt to China via Indian Ocean. If you go to Zambia and DRC, you see like 41% of cobalt production and 61% of lithium production, 28% of copper production in both countries. All of them are largely owned by the Chinese companies. You go to Mozambique. Mozambique, by the way, is one of the biggest graphite reserve globally. 70% of the stack is owned by an Australian company. You go to Namibia, it's both Chinese and some Western companies. I just wanted you to see the geopolitical competition between the West and the China, like the Chinese. On the left, you can see the Lobito corridor from Zambia going to from Zambia to DRC, Denangol, to take away the minerals from the continent. Then on the right, that the Tazara railway line I was talking about, it's from Zambia to Indian Ocean. So the question Africans are now asking is to say, where is an African in all these deals? Where is the African agent? Isn't it the time also to emphasize the amplification of the African agents, the amplification of the African voices in all these deals, or to walk the talk of that? Then how it is being expressed now by the government? It's being now expressed as resource nationalism. You go to Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe in 2022, for example, enacted an act of parliament to ban the exportation of raw lithium, encouraging beneficiation at the mining sites. So foreign-owned mining companies were forced now to come up with processing plants on site. In 2027, the government also announced that we are now banning the exportation of lithium concentrates We want to also go up the value chain. You go to Namibia, you see almost the same thing. Zambia is also some resource nationalistic policies, trying by all means to force local value addition, local beneficiation, local innovation. Ghana is green minerals policy. That one literally bans the exploitation of raw lithium. Tanzania has got 3 acts of parliament, which also banned the exploitation of all these minerals. Nigeria is where we go to Botswana, it renegotiated the deal with the BS to also get a greater share. The African Cool Belt, these 7 countries, we have seen a lot of resource nationalistic policies after this course. So this is how the industrial politics is manifesting in all these countries. When it comes to government now emphasizing African agents, emphasizing the amplification of African voices, also wanting to make sure that the locals are benefiting from their God-given minerals. As I'm concluding, these are some of the recommendations from the Global South countries in general, and Africa in particular. For example, to say we need to lobby for the decolonization and the reformation of the international governance order and the global financial architect. Reason being, they are lopsided in our disfavor. So even when it comes to financing just energy transition itself, the loans, it's either they are very expensive or they are inaccessible. Also advocating for amendment of the WTO regulations on resource nationalism and for free and fair trade. One of the most important ones is to make sure that Africa has to assume the rule-making role and stop being rule taker. Because in all these agreements, in all this memorandum of understanding, and what we have seen previously, like Africa has been the norm taker or the rule taker. So now the emphasis is on how about if we are to also be part of the rule makers. We make sure that it's local production, local processing, local value addition, local innovation. If we are not going to do that, then we are not going to allow you to do extraction of our minerals. Then also, to stop this extractivist approach, we are calling it from the pit to the pot. You just mine lithium or say maybe cobalt in DRC, it goes to the either Lobito railway line or Tazara railway line going to the port. So we want value addition, we want beneficiation of our minerals as well. Then also even to adopt the Chinese Indonesia model. In Indonesia, China is processing these minerals in what? In Indonesia. But at the same time, to also adopt unambiguous and clear empowering mining policies and laws. Because we don't want a situation whereby you scare away investors because of a lot of ambiguous policies or inconsistent policies. So it must be win-win, if I can put it that way. And new strategic partnerships to favor resource-rich, not resource-important countries. So in a way, also, like these are the ways subaltern communities, especially where mining is being done of these rare earth and critical minerals, this is what they are demanding. To say, we are not saying we don't want mining to be done by a foreign-owned company. We want, but we also want our share as the inhabitants of those communities. Otherwise, thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I think, as with your recommendations, your analysis of the kind of neo-colonial scramble for resources in Africa is unfortunately a pattern we see elsewhere in the world as well, in Asia and certainly in Latin America. We're going to turn now to Lala Peñaranda. Lala, I'm going to pass it over to you, and I'm going to put your bio in the chat as well.
Hi everyone. Thank you, John, for organizing this webinar. So my name is Lala Peñaranda. I'm the Latin America coordinator at TUED, and for those not familiar with TUED, it stands for Trade Unions for Energy Democracy. It's a network of about 130 unions in approximately 40 countries, founded about 12 years ago when trade unions identified an incoming wave of green structural adjustment proposals and just enthusiasm, not just in the green corporate sphere, but also, threateningly and dangerously in the trade union spaces as well. And so the project and the network was born knowing that trade unions couldn't just play a role of resistance, to this green green structural adjustment policy, but rather really had to put forward alternatives, and that we needed a coordinating network to identify what were common challenges and opportunities for trade unions. And so this question of what is the trade union role in shaping industrial policy has been at the core of TUED's work. And over the past 3 years, we've focused primarily on the TUED South platform, which is a platform of Global South trade unions. Mostly in the energy sector, but also just we believe that all sectors are part of or impacted by the just transition or by the energy transition, just or unjust. And so it really requires a transsectoral approach from unions. And I think, TUED has sort of two pillars of analysis. That the just transition isn't happening. In fact, that energy transition isn't happening, but rather there's an energy expansion, and that the reason behind this is the kind of market-oriented solutions to the energy transition. We believe that the profit imperative has to be taken out of this equation. And this is, of course, really relevant to how you think about industrial policy. If you think that industrial policy is to grow your GDP, and that's the ultimate goal, or if it's to respond to what the needs of a society are and to shape your economy accordingly. So it's really at the heart of the question. For this reason, TUED has adopted an approach that we call the public pathway to the just transition, which centers public and public popular, pública popular, as we call it in Latin America, ownership of energy in particular, and a democratic governance of that public energy. And I think that has influenced how we think about industrial policy and what we think the role of trade unions should be. And so when I was listening to the first part of this series on industrial policy, I was really, really interested in hearing the panelists talk about the need, and especially I think it was Isabel Estevez who was talking about the need at times to go beyond the state, and which is not to say that, well, I don't want to put her words into her mouth, but I think public ownership and public popular ownership, which can include community ownership, not just of the energy sector, but generally speaking of the industry that we're trying to develop, that it's not enough for it to be public, but that it is a prerequisite. And in being a prerequisite, we're sort of implying that there needs to be many other elements to this transition, many other criteria. And I really appreciated her framing around the need to think beyond just the ownership question, and in acknowledgement also that the state under capitalism, and especially under neoliberalism, has become extremely ineffective in providing solutions to workers, to the needs of a region as unequal as, say, Latin America, and that there needs to be not just pressure from below, but really designed from below, and designed from, I think the term civil society is sometimes so NGOized that it becomes like, this neutral thing, whereas I know that, we all see it as essentially talking about popular movements, social movements, mass class struggle, and its diversity. And so, so to address the question of how does TUID and how do we see the role of trade unions in the shaping of industrial policy? So I think the first thing is just to outline that trade unions are kind of organic or natural stakeholders in the shaping of production, kind of for a collective well-being. And I just got an ad come up, so let me close that. Okay. And so, I think trade unions can play and have played, and I'll get into some examples, a really important role in defining what production priorities should look like, not only on paper, but really in practice. Trade unions know better than many other sectors of society how implementation can happen, especially in industrial sectors, and can not only create jobs, but also, guarantee other elements like worker safety. And I think, something that, something that Comrade Jayati Ghosh talked about in the first session really stuck out to me, which is that, China's approach has taught us that we don't have to overemphasize the green. And I think trade unions have done a really good job at this in saying that, green industrial policy is right now the name of the game, but ultimately we're trying to solve multiple issues at once. We're trying to solve inequality. We're trying to solve precarity. We're trying to solve sovereignty and energy sovereignty, economic sovereignty, political sovereignty. And so I think trade unions are pretty strategically positioned to address several of these issues, including environmental justice, because many of the workers work in the areas where they have lived. And in this sense, unions aren't just kind of targets of policy, which is how unions are often talked about, like their concerns only go as far as job creation, but rather that they are, agents and designers, should be and have been, but should be increasingly designers of these policies for green industry, but also to address, as I was saying, all these other issues. And then I think the last point that I want to highlight in how trade unions can be really strategic to designing and shaping industrial policy is through the element of democratic governance. So we know that public ownership isn't enough, but for example, when a company like Ecopetrol, the majority 80% state-owned oil company in Colombia, is assigned, let's say, wind farm build out in indigenous territories, it becomes like a very important part of the unionized workers of Ecopetrol, of the USO union, to ensure that the projects that they're partaking in from the beginning include not just worker voices, not just finance transparency, not just kind of like a just power sharing, but that from beginning to end are respectful and are based on consensus-based practices for the indigenous communities in that territory, because ultimately it's going to be the workers and the communities in the territory. The state, most of those days, will not be physically present. And so I think when it comes to democratic governance and just implementation of really important projects, trade unions also play a really important role. And when done badly, it's detrimental not just to the relationships between trade unions and the communities, but to the entire project. And we've seen projects like this fail, and for good reason. And communities, for example, Mapuche territory in Chile, really going after trade unions because they have completely violated indigenous sovereignty. And so that damages not just that project, but really the credibility of public projects and trade unions to be allies of a just transition. So let me use the remaining minutes to talk about Colombia. So in Colombia, I think trade unions, I just want to highlight a few concrete ways in which they've partaken in the designing of industrial policy. So the first, I think, is around the labor reform. We know that it's not enough to, and this is based off of Comrade Eric Blanc's work and research, that it's really not enough to pursue manufacturing as like the core of your industrial policy, thinking that will necessarily take you to quality of life and dignified labor. What produced quality of life in manufacturing spaces in the United States was not the factories themselves, but the trade unions behind them. The ability of trade unions to push for working conditions and distribution of wealth in their communities. And I think the same goes when we think about manufacturing in Colombia. There's kind of a new hype with different research centers, left, heterodox economic research centers being born in Colombia under the Petro administration. IPP is one of them, and El Centro de Pensamiento por la Vida is another. And there's a big emphasis on, okay, what is our, where do we want to develop Colombian industry? And I think, underneath that is the question of how do we, like Colombia when you compare it to other OECD countries, it's the country that the workers most hour work and that least produce. Like we are incredibly inefficient in our production, and it's not the solution has been usually just to flexibilize work and break workers' backs. And we know that actually what's necessary is for a worker to not need to work 3 jobs and flexibilize everything, but to create the conditions that allow people to work fewer hours and more effectively with more value added. What leads to that? Labor reform, successful progressive labor reform. And that's also what leads to manufacturing, like actually delivering quality of life for Colombians. And again, we are one of the most unequal countries in the world, not just in land distribution, but also in wealth distribution. So when workers participated in sending their demands, their petitions, their declarations, their statements in the shaping of the policy, that was sort of one element of how they were, policy co-designers. But I just want to be really clear about this. The labor reform would not have passed, and we're crystal clear about this in the Colombian left. It would not have passed without the pressure of the unions in the streets, mobilization. Every time Petro had to make an interjection into Congress, he would threaten with worker mobilization. And if he didn't have that, it would not have passed. And you need not just workers to mobilize, but to completely appropriate the process and have been designers of it. And this led to the first worker rights victory in Colombia in over 34 years. So, it was, I think, La CUT, the central workers, the largest central workers, Central Unitaria de Trabajadores, was, they were in every stage next to Petro. And I really have to emphasize that we wouldn't have gotten that without that kind of pressure and without feeling that we are designers and stakeholders in this. John, how many minutes do I have left? One. Okay, great. I guess I'll just highlight also that the opposite, essentially. So, when Petro joined the assumed government, he had promised to redesign the free trade agreements that we have, which are one of the main limitations to economic sovereignty and development that we have in Colombia. And unfortunately, he has only tweaked some of the clauses and some of the chapters. And I think that this is what happens when you don't have that pressure. And it's, I think unions have been forced to be open on several fronts. But hopefully we can continue to focus on free trade agreements as one of the main fronts that we have to continue fighting on. And then just that to close, that the Oil Workers Union of Colombia, we have such few state-owned industries left, that you have this situation where Ecopetrol, as 80% state-owned, becomes one of the few, state companies that can influence and can sort of steer the new fronts that we want to open. So, for example, it makes sense that they would take on energy transmission, generation for renewables, great. But because we have such few, they've also had to take on the ownership of data centers. And I think this speaks to the need to think boldly about how trade unions can reclaim and restore public companies, and beyond energy, and into other sort of critical infrastructures, because we need a web. If industrial policy is going to happen, it needs to go beyond energy. It needs to go into health, education, data sovereignty, etc. So I'll close it off there, and thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Lala. That was excellent. And I really, this concept of design from below, I think is a really powerful concept that I'm going to push people on if I have a chance. I'll remind folks that if you do have questions, you can put them in the Q&A. That's the best place because they stay there and we can make sure we answer them. Ariel, thank you for joining us. I'm going to turn to you and I'll put Lala's bio in the chat and then Ariel, your bio in the chat as well so people can see who just spoke and who is about to speak. So thank you, Ariel, for joining us.
Can you give me a full screen or do I have to do it myself?
I think the participants get to see you full screen if they want to.
Yeah, I very much resonate with the concerns of my previous speakers, deeply resonate with the pain.
If you could speak up a little bit, Ariel, it's a little...
Resonate with the pain that stands behind their economic critiques. Let me say that while I'm living in Brazil, working in Brazil at the moment, the ideas that I want to share with you were developed in Oceania, in Australia, in Southeast Asia, where we have the same problem. We are fundamentally extractivist, particularly Australia, fundamentally an extractivist economy. Now, I speak not as an economist, but as a sociologist, and a sociologist of knowledge. So what I'm going to say is quite theoretical, and it may destabilize a few ideas here and there.
If you could, I'm sorry, people are having difficulty hearing you. Maybe if you lean closer to your computer or if you have or if you're able to speak louder.
I don't know. I'm about 8 feet away from the screen.
Do you have headphones, maybe? Do you have headphones?
And I'm working with Brazilian technology. So I'll try a bit more and speak a bit louder. Let me say first, are you hearing this? That corporate capture of policy discourse and politics is universal, and including the capture of global legal architecture. Are you okay with this, John? You hearing me?
I can hear you. Most important, of course, is for our audience and for our interpreters. Um, uh, but if you can monitor in the chat, you can see if people are hearing you. But I think if you raise your voice, if you shout at us, as if we are a big crowd out in a plaza and you have to reach the last row.
So what I'm saying is that agencies, states, unions, NGOs, unwittingly complicit with the extractivist discourse and its adoption of economics as a taken for granted mechanism, as a taken for granted representation of reality, if you like. I'd like to share with you briefly on that the critique of the Sustainable Development Goals, which we listed in our book, The Poo Reverse, co-edited with Ashish Kothari and Alberto Acosta and Escobar and Betty Di Maria and myself. So this is from our book, this is from the Poo Reverse book, came out in 2019. And it points out that the international model of green capitalism, which is what so many people are relying on now, transforming our world, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals, reveals the following flaws. No analysis of how the structural roots of poverty, unsustainability, and multidimensional violence are historically grounded in patriarchal, colonial, capitalist institutions like state power, corporate monopolies, and neocolonialism. The SDGs constitute an emphasis on economic growth as a driver of development, contradicting biophysical limits, with arbitrary adoption of GDP as the indicator of progress. The SDGs show continued reliance on economic globalization as the key economic strategy, undermining people's attempts at self-reliance and decolonial autonomy. SDGs show continued subservience to private capital and unwillingness to democratize the market through market producer and community control. Modern science and technology are held up as social panaceas, ignoring their limits and impacts and marginalizing other knowledges. Unregulated consumerism without strategies to reverse the global north's disproportionate contamination of the globe through waste, toxicity, and climate emissions are there. Neoliberal architectures of global governance become increasingly reliant on technocratic management and values by state and multilateral bureaucracies. The Sustainable Development Goals show inadequate focus on direct democratic governance and accountable decision-making by citizens and self-aware communities in face-to-face.
It looks like we have a break in the transmission. Hopefully, Ariel will come back and join us. In the meantime, oh, we lost you there for a moment, Ariel, but now you're back.
This is Brazil. I might say to you, I have a 5G tower right above the building that I'm living in. So there you go. So where are you up to? I was saying that culture, ethics, and spirituality are sidelined in Sustainable Development Goals and made subservient to economic forces. So the problem is the discourse of economics. It has to be cracked open. And this is where actually feminists, particularly ecological feminists, have a contribution to make. We hear a lot about greenwashing, but there's actually a lot about pinkwashing as well. That is when women become feminists, but they end up supporting the extractivist status quo in the assumption that this gives them equality. So I think the first thing we need to do is to amend the critique of capitalism and colonialism by seeing patriarchal, colonial capitalism as one single global system. We need to amend the key discourse of economics by basing it on patriarchal colonial capitalism. The state, of course, is a crystallization of patriarchal ego, and we cannot understand the functioning of capitalism without understanding how it is energized by patriarchal needs and motives and practices. So that's a fundamental ecological feminist claim. The second claim would be that the first premise of this capitalist, patriarchal, colonial capitalist conjuncture is the split between humanity versus nature, that they are two distinct separate fields, two distinct material fields. This is, of course, a nonsense, because we know that humans are nature in embodied form. What we need is a focus less on relations of production and more on relations of reproduction. This enables us to understand how we as human societies are embedded in natural systems. Relations of reproduction can be ecological, biological, psychological, or social, and they're all interconnected. This is what I call an embodied materialism, and it is an ecological feminist upgrading of Marxist materialist analysis, because it includes the body as part of the material infrastructure that we need to consider in our politics. An embodied materialism is based on a different logic than economics, which uses measurement and a linear logic. An embodied materialism uses a relational logic, which sees the capacities of biology, psychology, culture, and so on as circular rather than linear. So, in criticizing the economic lens as fundamentally unhelpful to our crisis, our current global crisis, ecological feminists suggest that we need an ecocentric lens. We need to expand the lens from the anthropocentric humanity angle and include the whole planetary framework, an ecocentric lens. This then allows us to look at how humans are embedded in ecological structures. It allows us to see the metabolism of humans in nature. And there's one class of workers across the world which is well aware of this and whose labour in fact regenerates this metabolism. And that is meta-industrial workers, whether they be domestic, whether they be peasants, whether they be indigenous peoples. They are working at the interface of humans with nature, and they are working regeneratively. So I want to suggest that industrial policy as we know it is essentially an idealism. It's based on the old culture, the old patriarchal culture of instrumental rationality, the culture based on measurement, a culture based on the development of instruments, tools, mechanisms, which fundamentally cut across the metabolism of humanity and nature. The extractivist frontiers of our present time, and I would name genetic engineering as the key rising extractivist frontier in contemporary capitalism, and digitization, which we're embedded in at the moment, as the second frontier of extractivism. In fact, you may have noticed that I moved from one room to another in my house because I could see the computer had lost its energy supply by about 30% in the first 10 minutes that we were online. So I want to say that it's not enough to change the discourse of policy. We need to look at the materialist effects of green capital or greening capital or trade union interventions. And this is something that I've written about at length in my recent book, DeColonize EcoModernism, where I make the point that it's not just the global south which is colonized, but the global north is equally colonized by these two extractivist frontiers. So we're all in this together. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Ariel. And you really you pushed the boundaries of our conversation as well. And so I think it's important for us to consider these other extractive frontiers because as you point out, it's not just the neo-colonial expropriation of resources from the global south, but this extractive process is happening in the global north as well. Um, I want to, first of all, thank all of the um, presenters. I want to encourage our audience to put any questions they have in the Q&A. And while we wait for you to put your questions in the Q&A, I'm going to ask our panelists to respond to each other. And I'm going to give you a prompt. I mean, they're basically two questions here I have. One is the role of the state. I mean, obviously, as you've all pointed out, the kind of traditional Keynesian approach to industrial policy, the state is involved in maximizing state policy for growth, for the increase of GDP. It's a very narrow approach to things. Um, we, the three of you, have presented an entirely different approach to, shall we call it transition, um, a transition that is really um, uh, pushed by folks from below, either designed by from folks uh, from below, accelerated, shaped. Um, but then what role is left for the state? I mean, anarchists would say we don't need a state. The state is inherently an oppressive instrument. Is that what we're saying? Or does the state simply become a kind of place of contestation? In other words, for different sectors of society to negotiate, for instance, policies. So that's one question. How do you imagine the role of the state? And the second is to continue this question of design from below. Lala offered, kind of a trade union perspective, how trade unions can participate. She offered the cautionary example, perhaps, of when trade unions are not participating or cooperating with other communities, for instance, indigenous communities. So, uh, how does this design process from below proceed? If you have a variety of different sectors in society, how is that design process negotiated? So those are kind of the two. They're kind of the same question, but looking at it from slightly different perspective. Um, I'm going to start with Kenny, and you can respond to that, or you can respond to what Lala and Ariel have said. I kind of leave it up to you how you want to respond.
Thank you very much, John. I think these are very, very important questions. Also reflecting on what Lala and Ariel said as well. On the first question, what I want to say is the role of the state, especially now, it depends to a large extent on the type of the state we have at the moment. So at the moment, if you have to look at it, the whole world, we are seeing the rise of the global far right. Authoritarianism is sweeping the world. So it is also giving credibility to the state itself to say we can still intervene. And now, in many cases, like the reason why we are talking about eco-authoritarianism, the state is intervening with a heavy hand in ways that many times are very much unprecedented in what we have seen. And the very shocking reality is in the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, where I was part of the postdoc, we call it neoliberal authoritarianism. The reason being, it's an oxymoron. How do you put together neoliberalism and authoritarianism? But it is exactly what we are finding at the moment. Fascism is rising in those democratic centers. You can't contest the fact that, like, for example, America is a democracy, but it is exactly where we are finding those undemocratic or authoritarian tendencies creeping in democratic reversal or democratic backsliding. So now, when it comes to green industrial policies or politics, more often than not, what we are finding is eco-authoritarianism. What we are finding is they are not addressing people's needs, even if the justification is justifiable to say, look, we are facing a poly crisis, a situation Lala was saying, it is very rare because we are witnessing multiple crises hitting simultaneously without any particular order. In itself, it would justify the employment of industrial policies, like what we've seen in the past. There's a crisis, the state comes in. But now it is coming in as a fascist like government. So it is where I would say contesting. So on the second question, designing from below, in itself, it is an expression of the nature of the state, which is increasingly becoming authoritarian, right? So designing from below is very much important now because people, they are not in any way prepared to see their entrenched democracy being reversed. They are trying by all means to make sure that the gain, the social gains, the political gains of democracy are what are protected. In a way, that's the reason why we are seeing a lot of social and political movement, trying to make sure that they are also part of the design process itself. But then what I wanted to ask Lala is, to what extent are you seeing this social movement, this political movement from below, winning when it comes to their resistance to eco-authoritarianism, if I can put it that way? Thank you so much.
Excellent. Okay, so the questions are accumulating. By the time it gets to Ariel, you will have many questions, I suspect. But Lala, let's go to you first.
Yeah, thanks, Kenny. That's a great question. Yeah, I think we see very often trade unions, and I work with a lot of the oil and gas worker unions in Latin America, saying if, we are a global South economy, we are an economy that has been forced by the capitalist model to be suppliers of primary goods, of raw material, and we need now to use the resources that we have, the wealth of the biodiversity that we have, to tackle inequality and to channel the wealth that these resources give us into creating industry that allows us to climb, one step above in the ladder of value added. And you hear this all the time, and with very good reason. I don't think that's a wrong analysis. I just think it's only part of the story. I think that it is the response that unions have when they have been essentially cornered into believing that they have very limited options. And I think I'll just speak for myself. I think my role is partially to work with rank and file workers and heterodox economists, researchers, community leaders to offer other options, other pathways for sovereign development, other pathways for reaching, goals that many of our movements actually share in common. And so, we challenge the kind of, it really sucks, but we have to do this austerity vision with, actually, we have, you know, a plethora of options, and let's consider them as unions, and let's really use the leverage that we have as unions in strategic sectors to make those, to like pry open those other alternatives. And I think, one example would be in the lithium sector, for example, okay, there's like several examples to say. I think for the USO plan, it was not just to deepen extraction of oil and gas, but to consider, petrochemical development, which not everybody agrees with, but it is slightly diversifying the portfolio of Ecopetrol. It's working because we bought Ecopetrol, purchased ESA, which is the transmission company, to get into transmission and generation of renewable electricity, and as like something to interconnect if we're going to have a stable grid. It's to get into fertilizers for the agriculture industry that is, according to Petro's plan, going to at least partially replace dependence on coal. And it's to help, for example, to create EcoMinerales, the state-owned mining company, which will provide minerals through strict environmental restrictions to the transition. And so I think, it's thinking of many other options other than just we need to deepen our extractive frontier. Of course, one could say all of those sectors are extractive. And I think that, as Thea Riofrancos often highlights, there's a difference between, or we should differentiate between extraction and extractivism. Extraction being, the activity of extracting minerals, and extractivism being the kind of economic model that makes us dependent on the export of this economic model that is also rooted in, state violence, colonialism, etc. And I'll just finish also saying that I think trade unions, to your question, Kenny, can also play a directing role and put conditions. And I think we don't do that enough. So for example, for lithium extraction, can trade unions as lithium federations, jointly between the lithium producing countries, but this could apply to other minerals as well. Can we put pressure to make conditions, to apply conditions to what that lithium is used for? Can we direct it towards, for example, public transportation, as opposed to the bottomless pit of consumption for electric vehicles that continues to create cities dependent on individual vehicles, and which will put mineral pressure on communities that will be very hard to do under a just model. So can we, in a sense, support degrowth goals while strengthening public infrastructure like public transportation? I think that's something that trade unions can and should do as these, designers from below.
Excellent. Thank you, Lala. And you actually began to answer the question that has appeared in our Q&A from Tobias, and I'm going to restate it. and then add it to the questions that have been accumulating for Ariel to answer. And that question is this challenge, this tension between an industrial policy from below, for instance, a trade union driven industrial policy, and a post-development environmental justice approach. And the degrowth or post-growth model, for instance, that Lala was talking about, distinguishing between how lithium is used, whether for individual cars or a public transportation model. That certainly is one way of addressing this tension between these two approaches. But Ariel, please answer however and whatever you would like to answer.
My first thought is that the problems we have in this world today, the problems we're all concerned about combating, are to do with the relations of reproduction. Relations of reproduction. That is the production of life on Earth, whether it be ecological life or human life. And the tools of economics can never attend to these problems because they are developed within the relations of production. Or as a very wise Black American feminist said about 30 years ago, the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house.
Excellent. Thank you. Yes, that Andre Lorde, I think, was the woman who said that. And I think that is a useful way of challenging economists. And I think economists are imprisoned by their models, unfortunately. And we are trying to develop among us some new tools to dismantle the houses that we don't want to be in. Um, uh, Dottie Guerrero has a good example that she's put in our chat on the People's Vaccine campaign during the height of COVID, and I do think um, that is an interesting example of, especially in an emergency situation. And you could argue that from the point of view of reproduction, we are in an emergency situation on this planet with the poly crisis, not just the climate crisis, but of course, a number of the other crises that people have mentioned from um, bioresources to genetic resources to the digital universe. We face a lot of crises, and so we have to develop quite a few um, new tools to address this. Um, I mm,
Regarding vaccine production and the crisis of reproduction in human societies, in as much as the vaccine was using mRNA technology, it was in fact cutting against relations of reproduction. And the ultimate conclusion of this form of extractivism will be the unraveling of evolutionary relations between species. So I think we need a much bigger framework of understanding there.
mm, thank you. Yes. Um, let us go back we have about 11 minutes. I want to give you all a chance to give some final thoughts on this question. And let me ask you to think perhaps on what our next steps are. And I don't mean our next steps here among the panelists. I mean collectively. We have a couple of perhaps inspiring examples of design from below, of embodied materialism. We have some good examples of that, but in many cases they're isolated. And as Kenny reminds us, we have a rise of far-right authoritarianism, and they have their own conception of how the state should act and how economies should be shaped. And it's pretty much the opposite of what we are talking about here. So we are both trying to generate new ideas for a kind of new approach, and at the same time responding to some rather dangerous trends in the global political sphere. So, given those challenges, where do we begin? And I want to start with Kenny, because you have a list of, you gave us a list of recommendations, and I'm wondering if you could highlight, say, one example from Africa that you could say this is either an example of resistance or an example of creation of an alternative that is inspiring and that perhaps can lead us in a particular direction. And then I'll go to Lala and ask you for something similar, again, maybe from within the sphere of trade union organizing in Latin America or in the Americas more generally. And Lala, Ariel, I'm gonna ask you for maybe an example of embodied materialism, how you see that emerging in any concrete examples. But let's start with Kenny.
Thank you so much. My response to that, we have seen a lot of communities in South Africa that resisted mining operations in their communities, and they even won. Some won, of course, some failed. So what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say, to borrow Lala's word, to like framing of it, the issue of co-designing is very important. Like the issue of designing from below is very important. If anything, we want a situation whereby the precarized, the marginalized subaltern communities have the right to say no to any development project, especially now renewable energy projects or mining of these critical minerals and rare earth elements, which are not benefiting them the way they would want to see benefiting them. What I'm trying to say is we need to say no to extractive imperialism in the 21st century. That replay of, to borrow Ariel's word, that is like the reproduction crisis we are having, to say the colonial, social, political, and economic relations we are seeing now being replayed in this just or unjust energy transition narratives. That is what we want to see ending, with the people now being at the center of development, with the people now being the shapers and the makers of their policies. If I can give you like a quick example, in one of the provinces in South Africa, communities, they resisted mining operations. Of course, it was coal, and they won it. And they even said, we want tourism and not mining. And because of that, that is what the community would say is benefiting us more than mining. So I think from that perspective, that is what is gonna end extractive imperialism we are seeing playing out at the moment.
Excellent. Thank you. I think, this idea of prior and informed consent, which is just a phrase, but it can be very powerful, a very powerful tool for communities to resist and to choose the path that they want, as you point out. So very helpful. Lala.
Yeah, thanks, Kenny, for that. So, okay. I guess first to highlight that, of course, the state is a terrain of contestation for trade unions. And this is also true in the design of industrial policy. We see a rotating door between the private sector and especially multinational corporations and the state, where if they're not in one position, they're in the other. Like either they're the corporations negotiating with the state, or they're the state negotiating with their former partners. And I think, for example, in the creation of the Brazil new industrial policy, NIB as it's called, there was a board called the National Council for Industrial Development, which was one of those like tripartite things that was designed to develop Brazil's industrial policy now under the Lula progressive, in theory, administration. And that board is composed of 20 ministries. So there's the state, great. 21 counselors representing civil society, 16 business entities, and only 3 trade unions. And so I think that this balance of forces, especially since civil society is often not politicized, class-based, et cetera, but has been neutralized and depoliticized, structurally and by design. I think these, who is shaping our policies and who gets to implement them is it's the starting point for neoliberal policy that then trade unions have to bear the brunt of, workers have to bear the brunt of. So we are constantly contesting the participation of trade unions, but of course, not just the participation. We know that when these neoliberal trade policies and industrial policies end up showing, being published, for example, Chile's lithium policy being based on public-private ownership, or, when the Colombian government fails to recognize that the Swiss company they blocked, that they like repackaged and petitioned to mine in, it's the same company with another name, that it's unions, that it's workers saying, these are the same people, have you not noticed? That it's workers doing the observatory work and saying, we will not take public-private, we want public community, and haven't you noticed these are the same people? Come on, guys, wake up. So it's doing the like pushback, the counterbalance, the like, it's really the element of implementation. And then just to close, it's impossible to not mention the genocide in Gaza, and to say that industrial policy has always existed, and especially with regards to militarism, and that increasingly we're seeing industrial policy hyping up our military sector across the world, including in the global south, and that unions have played a role in stopping some of these at the point of production or the point of transport. So dock workers or coal workers stopping the boats, blocking the boats as they call it, or blocking, striking against coal that is being sent from Colombia to Israel, et cetera. Or in the United States, migrant worker alliances, fighting back against the militarization and deportation machine that existed under Biden and now doubly under Trump. We're going to need workers to not just say we don't want militarization, but also we do want care, like cops not care, or all these formulations. Sorry, and yeah, I think lastly, this really is the last point, that for economies of the global south like Colombia that have 50% plus workforce in the informal sector, industrial policy has to be about providing this massive part of our workforce with jobs, with protections, with the dignified life. And one of the elements in the Brazil industrial plan that I hope to see in many others was a goal of reducing transportation from home to workplace. That's the industrial policy goals I want to see, like actually better, the lives of working class people. So I think there are examples, and I think trade unions will continue to play a critical role.
Excellent, thank you. And Ariel, you have the last word or words.
Oh, well, I've lived a long time. I think I've earned it now. Yes, I want to say that I think the language of economics, when it's used in arguments about decoloniality, is quintessential nonsense. It's Eurocentrism through and through. So that needs to be penetrated. But let me say that there is an alternative economy existing worldwide. It's an economy sustaining relations of reproduction in the work of domestic caregivers, peasants, indigenous peoples, and so on, what you might call meta-industrial labor skills. And this the logic of this non-patriarchal colonial capitalist alternative is found in groups like the bioregional movement, the worldwide bioregional movement, which breaks down the split between humanity and nature. It's found in Buen Vivir, it's found in the Eco Village Network, it's found in the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, which is a new network reaching from Mexico to India and beyond, recognizing the logic, the life-affirming logic of this alternative form of economy and survival. So I just urge people to consider these things seriously. At the moment, they cannot be seen or discussed because the hegemony of economics is so strong. It blinds people to the existence of these other activities.
Well, thank you, Ariel. That was a very hopeful and appropriate way to end with citing some excellent alternatives that are out there that we may not have heard about because, as you say, they're not exactly headlines in mainstream newspapers, but global tapestry of alternatives, eco-village, bioregional movement, very important to look at those. I want to thank you all for your excellent presentations. This has been recorded, and so your words will live on, and others will be able to hear you as well. I will send that out, a link not only to you and to the people who were listening today, but also to everyone who signed up for this session and others in networks that have been following this work. And thank you for all of the interpretation. We deeply appreciate your work translating our words into different languages and back again. And of course, very appreciative of everyone in the audience. And so we will follow up with more of work on these issues. Please follow the links that are in the chat to find out more about the publications of our panelists and the work of our co-sponsoring organizations, the Institute for Policy Studies and the Global Working Group Beyond Development. So thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you at our next session.